This old Nevada saloon looks like it belongs in a western. It's dusty, sunbaked, and still going strong after the town around it boomed and busted. And for over a century, the Pioneer Saloon has seen everything. Unsolved deaths, accusations of murder, even Hollywood legends, leading to the kind of ghost stories which make even the bar staff uneasy. We're talking poker games that ended in gunfire, phantom miners still nursing that last beer, a famous actress whose death still fuels rumours, and a bathroom ghost that nobody can explain, no matter how hard they try. Because while the bodies may be long gone from this old bar, the bullet holes are still right there in the tin walls. And the ghosts, if you believe the stories, they're definitely not done here. But who are they? And what's their story? And why do they continue to linger at the Pioneer Saloon? So about 40 miles southwest of the glittering lights of the Las Vegas Strip, you can find a little town called Goodsprings. It's sometimes referred to as a ghost town, but there are actually still people living there. It's not completely abandoned. But it was during the mining boom in this area, in the late 19th century, early 20th century kind of time, where our story starts. Because around this time, the Clark County Commissioner, a guy called George Fale, he could see the growth in this area. The mineral reserves were rich, people were flocking to work in the mines, Goodsprings was booming. And what are all these miners going to want after a long shift underground? Entertainment, in the form of music, gambling, alcohol and women. And so in 1913, George opened up the Pioneer Saloon. And while it wasn't the only saloon in town, it was massively popular. So much so that George actually capitalised on this demand for hospitality in Goodsprings and opened up a hotel, the Fale Hotel, a few years later in 1916. And I know it sounds a little bit ironic, a businessman being called Fale, but it isn't F-A-I-L, it's F-A-Y-L-E. Just feel like I need to clarify that. But the Pioneer, it would stand the test of time, surviving through events that were closing down businesses all around it, like the Spanish influenza, which actually took George Fale's life on the 9th of December 1918, aged just 37. And George, like quite a few different people that we're going to be talking about today, he's now buried in Goodsprings Cemetery. But the Pioneer Saloon, that place stuck around. Even a prohibition raid in 1924 couldn't finish it off. The town of Goodsprings started to decline in the post-war period, the population dropped off, and a bunch of buildings actually burned down, including the Fale Hotel, which was destroyed in 1966. As of the census in 2020, there were only 162 residents still living in the town, but the Pioneer Saloon, still seemingly well worth the trip if you're over that way. To this day, it's still got the original stamped tin walls and the same stove from 1913. It's still serving food and drinks, they've got live music, little bits of memorabilia on display on the walls, things like that. And if you're into your pop culture, you might actually recognise the place too. It was the backdrop for Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, starring Johnny Depp, Christina Ricci and Tobey Maguire. Also Miss Congeniality 2 with Sandra Bullock. It was also in the music video of Five Finger Death Punch's Blue on Black. Absolutely love that song. Or, if you're a gamer, remember the Prospector Saloon in Fallout New Vegas? Yep, based on the Pioneer Saloon. I absolutely love this, but the Pioneer Saloon now has a Fallout event. So fans of the game descend on Goodsprings each year, and it's basically like a whole thing. How brilliant is that? Aside from that though, the Pioneer Saloon is said to be incredibly haunted, being another reason why people flock to the place. They do play up the paranormal, ask staff members about the ghost stories, and they more than likely won't mind telling you a tale or two. They even have a ghost burger on the menu, a poltergeist burger, and a haunt dog. But if these next stories are to be believed, perhaps the Pioneer Saloon has good reason to make a big deal out of it, because this place is forever tied to something much darker, after the night when Hollywood tragedy struck right here in the Nevada desert. Because when the USA entered World War II, a lot of Hollywood celebrities wanted to do their bit for the war effort, including the actress Carole Lombard. She was a massive star at the time, having played roles in in movies like My Man Godfrey, To Be or Not to Be, and Nothing Sacred. Carole Lombard had travelled from LA back to her home state of Indiana on a war bond rally, basically raising money for the war effort, which she did incredibly well at, raising over $2 million. After the rally had wrapped up, Carole was very keen to get back home to LA, and more specifically to her husband, Clark Gable. She wanted to get back as quickly as possible, and so suggested flying back. But her mom and Clark Gable's press agent, Otto Winkler, who had both travelled out with her, they didn't want to. They wanted to stick to the original plan, just go back on the train, that's already what's planned, let's just do that. The story goes that the decision was made via a coin toss, which Carole won, and so on the 16th of January 1942, they boarded a transcontinental and Western Air DC-3 aeroplane to get back home. Carole's parting words to fans were, "Before I say goodbye to you all, come on and join me for a big cheer, V for victory." The first leg of the journey was fine, but after they'd stopped off to refuel in Las Vegas, that's when it all went wrong. Conditions were clear, but it was getting into the evening in January and there was no moon that night, so it was already dark. Because there was a fear of Japanese bombers flying over, the safety beacons on the Nevada mountains had been shut off. So when the plane took off from Vegas, it was basically flying blind a little bit. Just 15 minutes later, it slammed straight into the Potosi Mountain. I can't even imagine what it must have been like on board. I'm sort of hoping that it was at least quick, and that they wouldn't have known about what was to happen until like a second or two before impact. But what a horrendous reason to crash, just absolutely awful. The Pioneer Saloon, being only about 14 miles from the mountain, was chosen as a bit of a hub for rescue efforts. Reporters made a base here, so did people involved in search and rescue. On hearing the news that Carole's plane had gone down, Clark Gable rushed to Nevada, and apparently he waited at the Pioneer Saloon as well for news of the crash, hoping, praying that it would be good news and that they would be found safe. But because it was January, it was very snowy up the mountain, and they'd crashed in such a remote area, getting to the crash site was treacherous in itself. And there are now burn marks on the bar of the Pioneer Saloon, and it's said that these are cigarette burns because, again, apparently, Clark Gable would sit at the bar chain smoking, waiting for news of his wife, and then he would fall asleep and leave these cigarette marks on the bar. But when rescuers finally reached the crash site, it wasn't good news. Carole, her mom, and Otto Winkler, along with all the flight crew and US Army personnel who were also on board, they were all killed in the crash. Carole's body was officially identified through dental records, and that was that. Her body, along with the others, were brought down the mountain, and Clark took her home to LA to make a start on funeral arrangements. That's the story. It's as it's told anyway, and now the Pioneer Saloon does have a little memorial bit to Clark Gable and Carole Lombard, as it was still a significant place for the search and rescue efforts anyway. But based on the newspapers at the time, Clark may not have waited at the Pioneer Saloon. According to the Los Angeles Times, Clark had himself tried to actually join the search party, but he was turned away, and instead he was persuaded to return to his bungalow at the Hotel El Rancho in Las Vegas, as that's where he was staying. And there was a book that came out about the crash called Fireball, Carole Lombard and the Mystery of Flight 3, which said that Clark never went to the Pioneer Saloon at all. It was crawling with reporters waiting to hear news about the crash, which they're the last people that you want to see when you're a massive Hollywood star and your wife, also a massive Hollywood star, is missing after a plane crash. Also, if he had been at the saloon, the reporters would have written about it, you know? But instead, the newspaper articles at the time state that he was at the El Rancho in Vegas. So yeah, couldn't exactly verify that bit. But regardless of that, there are people who claim that the ghost of Carole Lombard now haunts the Pioneer Saloon, because patrons and staff have reported hearing disembodied weeping and sobbing coming from the women's bathroom, even when categorically there is no one inside there. Sometimes the figure of a blonde woman has been spotted crying, and so that's led people to think that it is Carole. Apparently there was also a psychic medium who made contact with this female entity, and she asked her why she was crying, but she didn't get a response. But when she asked the entity why she was still hanging around the Pioneer Saloon, she was supposed to have responded saying that this is where Clark is. That's a claim from a psychic medium though, so up to you whether you put any stock in that or not. Because, I mean, if the newspapers are true, Clark was never there anyway, so it just seems odd that Carole would find herself here after that. That's not to say that he didn't drop into the saloon at some point. maybe he did, we just can't verify it. However, there is apparently a piece of the plane wreckage on display at the Pioneer Saloon, so could it be that that's got some sort of energy attached to it from the crash and that's causing the activity? I don't know, something to think about. Side note though, a little bit of a tangent, which is still kind of related. There is a story about how the Potosi Mountain, where the plane crashed, is now haunted. There are still rusted parts of the wreckage up there, it couldn't all be salvaged, but the legend goes that on the 16th of January, the anniversary of the plane crash, the engine sounds of an old aircraft can be heard flying towards the mountain at night, but you never see anything, and so people believe that it's the echo of the fatal flight. But as for Carole possibly haunting the Pioneer Saloon, some people aren't so sure, or they believe that there is possibly another woman alongside Carole, who also seems to prefer the privacy of the women's bathroom. Heads up though, right from the top, I believe this entity first came about from a Ghost Adventures episode. So yeah, I'm including her here because, I don't know, the connection to Carole Lombard seems tenuous at best anyway. Not saying she isn't there, just exploring other options. And it is an interesting take that it could be someone else instead. So again, do with this information what you will. Some people believe that a woman called Ruby Hill Barnes could be haunting the Pioneer Saloon. And there is a Ruby buried in Goodsprings Cemetery who died in 1948, aged 30. And we don't have any historical record on her life, we don't know how she died or anything like that. But supposedly there was, again, a psychic medium who got in contact with Ruby and found out that Ruby was actually working in Goodsprings General Store next door, and she was murdered in there by her estranged husband, who then, wanting to at least attempt to cover up what he had done, he dragged her body into the Pioneer Saloon and left her in the women's bathroom. Again, not a shred of proof, no record, no police reports, no newspaper articles, nothing. But even if we don't know who specifically is said to be haunting the women's bathroom of the Pioneer Saloon, that hasn't stopped countless people from hearing these disembodied cries in there, even when no one's around. The previous owner of the saloon, Noel Shekels, he had his own run-in with this entity one night. There was a slot machine that had broken, and so he had to wait for the bar to close for his mate to come and help him fix it. So way past midnight, and the two guys made their way into the bar. All of a sudden, Noel started hearing a woman crying coming from the bathroom. Immediately, he's on high alert, thinking, oh no, this is patron who got locked in past closing, all of this. So he goes over to the closed door and says, look, ma'am, we're closed, you need to leave. As soon as he said that, the crying just stopped. Which, when you're in that situation, that kind of seems almost worse. As his mind immediately went to, oh my god, she was really upset, she's done something stupid, she's taken her own life, like anything like that. He opened the door expecting to see something horrific. And I mean, yeah, what he did see was horrific because he saw absolutely nothing. There was not a single living soul in that bathroom, even though he'd most definitely heard a woman crying, and the woman had stopped crying when he tried to talk to her. So yeah, understandably, he was a little bit in shock after that. All the saloon doors were locked, there was nowhere that a woman could have gone. Sometimes it's not crying that people hear, but it's someone coughing or almost clearing their throat, like they want attention, they want to be heard. But again, there's no one around. Someone who we do know for sure a lot more about is a man called Paul Kowski, who still haunts the Pioneer Saloon, and he's mad about it. Because the thing about these mining boom towns, especially in Nevada, when everyone was moving in trying to get their slice of the mining riches, was that it was still in the world of the Wild West. There were lawmen present, but more often than not, you took matters into your own hands, and combine that with drinking and gambling and possibly quite big egos, yeah. In 1915, just 2 years after the Pioneer Saloon opened, that would become oh so apparent. On the 26th of June, there was a group of men playing poker around the table at the saloon. Everything was going fine until it was Paul Kowski's turn to deal. An out-of-work miner with a bad attitude and an unlikable character. As Paul dealt the cards, a few of the men folded that just sit this one out, until only Paul and another guy were still in play. All of a sudden, Joe Armstrong, one of the men who had folded, called out Paul. He piped up and said, oi, hang on a minute, I just watched you pull a card for yourself from the bottom of the deck. Paul denied it, but the bartender had been hovering around the table and said, no, I saw you do it as well. You and the other guy should just split the pot and start the round again. Paul was having absolutely none of that though. That is not happening. So he stood up and went to grab the money out the middle of the table. No, that's not how we're doing things here. So Joe, he stood up too and pushed Paul back. You're not taking the money. Paul Kowski, he was a big, powerful man though. He'd been a prize fighter before becoming a miner. so he went to climb over the table to get to Joe. But Joe, even though he was in his 60s, he was an ex-army man, and so he whipped out his 6-shooter and pistol whipped Paul around the head. Paul came back up again and went to grab Joe's gun, so he shot him, the first bullet going through Paul's hand and into his chest. But by that point, being a big guy, you've got the alcohol and the adrenaline going. He didn't stop, so Joe fired again and again, and only then did Paul Kowski slump to the floor, dead. Obviously, there was an investigation into what had happened. A man had been murdered inside the saloon, but Joe Armstrong got away with it. The murder was ruled justifiable, that the shooting had been in self-defense, based on the fact that Paul Kowski was a not very nice man and had been caught cheating. No one had a good word to say about him, but Joe, on the other hand, universally liked. Resident of the Goodsprings area for 15 years, a gentleman of the highest order. Paul Kowski was buried in the Goodsprings cemetery, but the newspaper clippings and coroner's report are still on the wall in the Pioneer, right next to the bullet holes said to be from the shots that killed him. And if the stories are true, Paul's ghost is still here too, staring down anyone who dares to play cards at his table. It's said that before you see him, you might smell a really strong, overpowering stench of old-fashioned aftershave, which is thought to be him. Stepping back, just for a second, would a big old nasty out-of-work miner have had access to cologne in 1915? I would have thought cheap whiskey and cigarettes would have made more sense, but I don't make up the rules for the ghosts. That's just the story. Body odour aside though, a lot of people have reported being in the saloon, just hanging out, having a drink, just noticing that there's a guy properly staring at them, and not in a nice way, just a super intense, bro, are you good? You lose something over here kind of way. The image that immediately sprang to mind when I was reading that was the Kevin Hart grandpa stare, like he's staring through your soul. And if that's not bad enough, sometimes his clothes are still stained with his blood from the gunshot wounds too. But the table that Paul died at is still in the saloon, you can still sit at it. And there was one story of a guy who was sat at the poker table, and similarly to others, he noticed this guy, and he kept on poking his head around the doorway to look at where he was sat. And it happened again and again. They would look up and see this man with his head poking out from behind the doorway, just staring at them. Not cool, man, not cool at all. Eventually, they decided that they'd had enough. They didn't know the ghost story at this point, and so just thought it was a particularly unfriendly local or something. So they walked through the doorway to where this guy must have been standing to find that there was absolutely no one there. But again, nowhere for this person to have escaped. He would have had to walk past the poker table to get out. Feeling more than a little bit unsettled at this, they asked the bartender, who then proceeded to tell them about Paul. So yeah, maybe he just likes to keep an eye on the poker table, making sure no one else is going to get caught cheating and end up like him. But this next entity said to be haunting the Pioneer Saloon, this one is really sad, because apparently there is the ghost of a little boy whose name is Mikey. And little Mikey, he was said to be the son of one of the ladies of the night who would keep the miners company at the saloon, and so when Mummy was working, he would have to entertain himself. One night, poor Mikey either fell down a well or a mine shaft that was underneath the kitchen and unfortunately passed away. Before you start wondering, yes, there is actually a mine shaft under the floor of the saloon. But now, to this day, people claim to hear the sounds of a little kid running barefoot across the wooden floorboards, even past closing when there's no one around or everyone's present and accounted for and they're all sat down. But also kitchen staff have spotted a little kid running around the patio area when again, no one's around, certainly no kids late at night or anything like that. But sometimes there is someone else who's seen. And while now he definitely leaves an impression on you, kind of the sort of character that you're going to remember, back in the town's heyday, almost every drinker in the bar would have looked like him. Because it wouldn't be an old haunted saloon without the ghost of a miner being witnessed. He's said to be dressed in dirty work boots, Levi jeans, and a crumpled up cowboy hat. It definitely looks like he's just put in a long hard shift in the mines. He's not super tall, and he's normally just hanging around the bar area. He seems pretty harmless, but he's just around. He sometimes appears just as flesh and blood as you and me. And there was one person who said that they'd had a pretty bad day and they'd been fired from their job and they just wanted a drink at the bar. It was a super crowded night though, and there was only one seat free, right at the far end, so they went and took it. As they're there, stewing over everything that had happened that day, they just suddenly became aware of a man standing right next to them. In absolutely no mood to be making small talk with a rando, they just told them to get out of here, get lost. This guy didn't seem to be taking no for an answer, and so he just stood there, grinning at them. And so they called over the bartender and asked her about this guy, like, is he alright? What's his deal? Like, why won't he leave me alone? To which the bartender replied, oh, don't worry about about him, he's just our ghost. They turned back to get another look at him, now armed with this new information, to find that he had completely disappeared. In a crowded bar, there wasn't really any place for him to have just ducked out of sight. He had just dematerialized, even though he had seemed real just seconds ago. In a busy room though, you don't normally get many ghost stories like that where they appear with so many people around. But he still does make his presence known in quieter moments too. There was one bartender who was closing up for the night and they were going around, locking up, tidying away, all that sort of stuff, when they just walked back into the bar area to see this guy, crumpled cowboy hat and all, standing at the end of the bar, drinking a beer. As they were staring at him, he looked up and stared straight back before slowly vanishing away into nothing. I don't think we've got much of a backstory on who he was. Maybe he was a victim of a little Wild West justice, or maybe he was killed in the mines but wanted to come back to the Pioneer Saloon for one last beer for the road. But maybe he got served that beer from another entity at the Pioneer Saloon, as one of the previous owners is also rumoured to still haunt the place. The story behind him, kind of legend really, goes that he was drinking in the bar one day when all of a sudden he just dropped down stone cold dead. The bartender who was working that day was said to have picked up his glass of beer, said "here's to you," and smashed it on the floor as his boss lay there. Which, that's pretty hardcore. I'm guessing that means that he was a good boss? Kind of like a final salute, raise your glass, and then smashing the glass so no one else can use it after his boss? Unless I'm missing a huge piece of social context, in which case, please do enlighten me. But that's the story of the old saloon owner who's said to still be hanging around, although I couldn't find any witness accounts of how he manifests, just that he's supposedly there. However, I also couldn't find any record of a saloon owner who had just dropped down dead at the Pioneer. But what I did find was one who had died from a lead overdose, administered by a disgruntled patron. Because on the 9th of March 1918, Charles Harrison, also known as Doc, he was shot in the Pioneer Saloon by a guy called James McManus, after Doc was attempting to throw him out of the bar at 10 in the morning. So I just thought that was an interesting piece of history, and perhaps an alternative explanation to the entity known as the saloon owner, who's said to still haunt the place. Maybe it's Doc Harrison. But aside from this cast of ghostly characters said to still be lingering around the place, if the psychic mediums are to be believed, there are so many more entities hanging around the place. It's entirely up to you however you feel about mediums though. I know people have very strong feelings both ways about them, so I'm just gonna reel them off because I still think it's interesting. First of all, we've got Jim, who is said to appear as a bit of a gunslinger looking type, but he's actually a Native American who now hangs around the Pioneer Saloon as a bit of an overseer, quietly watching over everything that goes on, and is just this very peaceful, calming presence. Less peaceful are the apparently multiple ladies of the night who would have frequented the saloon and kept the miners company while they drank. They're said to interact with men who visit the Pioneer now, and they'll touch your hair or brush their fingers along your neck and things like that. And I did also come across a claim that there is another miner haunting the place, and his name is Jeremy. Apparently Jeremy doesn't want to move on, he's scared about what he will face when he crosses over to the other side, and so that's why he's now stuck here, so mediums claim. But aside from actual entities who hang around here, so much weirdness has been reported at the Pioneer Saloon. Shadow figures are a relatively common occurrence. You'll just see them flitting about in the corner of your eye, or you'll catch them walking past tables in the memorial room. There was once a bartender who was so terrified on one of her shifts that she had to be driven home. She refused to be left alone. Apparently she was watching a shadow figure follow around a particular customer all night. No explanation. And sometimes it's not just figures seen, but you may look over and see smoke, like cigar or cigarette smoke hanging in the air. Only I'm pretty sure it is illegal to smoke in public places in Nevada. Either way, it's long after the bar has closed down. There hasn't been anyone in the building other than the bartender closing down for hours. Certainly no one's smoking kind of thing. But there was one time where, again, the previous owner, Noel Shekels, he saw this smoke. As he walked towards it, he claimed that it almost wrapped around him, but it gave him this feeling of overwhelming calm. It was a positive, happy experience. But unsurprisingly enough, there does seem to be a lot that goes on once the Pioneer Saloon has closed for the night. Disembodied sounds of laughter, breathing, coughing, glasses clinking, all of that can be heard, as if the bar is full of life and bustling with customers. And then there are some more unusual accounts. The chandelier that's hanging in the memorial room, that allegedly came from a haunted mansion in Riverside, California, and has been seen swinging even though there's no draft. But then the old antique telephone that's on display, just as an ornament, it's not plugged in or anything like that, that sometimes rings. But when you pick it up, there's nothing on the other end, just silence. I don't really know how old-timey phones work, but could that be anything to do with a dodgy connection on the inside? Maybe the heat of Nevada during the day and the cold at night expanding and contracting something inside, and that's making the phone ring? I don't really know, to be honest. Either way, I'd still be absolutely bricking it if a phone that I knew had no connection was ringing. I've seen the movie The Ring. I don't pick up the phone for anybody anyway. But while all this seems harmless, if a little creepy, although infinitely creepier if you're closing down on your own, admittedly, there was one account I came across which hints at there being something a little more malevolent at the Pioneer Saloon. The assistant general manager at the time, a woman called Christy Cristiano, she was working in the kitchen when she felt what she described as hot oil being poured on her leg. That sickening, burning feeling. Something has just happened and she was hurting. So she went off to the side for a second just to check her leg and saw that there were 3 scratch marks running down her leg. Nothing on her clothes that could have scratched her, no reason for these scratches. They just appeared along with the pain. Not only that, but she said that she felt really nauseous and had a horrible, heavy, uneasy feeling. And it's really hard to explain how that would feel in the moment, but it's like your gut just knows something is wrong. All your instincts from your lizard brain are telling you that things aren't right, proceed with caution kind of thing. She said that this feeling lasted for about 6 hours, so not an insignificant amount of time when you're feeling rotten, but eventually it did lift. Time went on and she put the incident to the back of her mind. Nothing else had happened, so that was that, right? Until a few years later when it happened again. And again, it felt like a hot burning sensation. But this time it was on her head and moving down her neck. And when she looked, yeah, there were scratches, accompanied by that unmistakable, heavy, uneasy feeling. But this was much worse this time, and Christy said that it lasted days before she was able to shake it off. I'm not sure if anything else happened after that. I think that might have been the end of it. But still, getting potentially scratched by something I can't see and then feeling naff after it, not about that. But after all of that, who is really haunting this old saloon? Is it Carole Lombard, tied here by her tragedy? Is it Ruby, the woman whose entire connection to the place is still a bit of a question mark? Is it the poker cheat Paul? The old miner? Doc Harrison, maybe? Or just echoes from a time that the place refuses to let go of? I guess the truth is that no one can say for sure, but if you ever find yourself sitting at the Pioneer Saloon's bar, just know that even if you can't see anyone, you're probably not drinking alone. If I ever get to visit though, I would be totally okay with that, sharing my beer with a ghost. I really hope that someday I do make it out to Nevada. I'd obviously love to go to Vegas and see all of the haunted hotels that I've been chatting to you about, but then also to take a drive out to Goodsprings. I'd love to visit the Pioneer Saloon for the ghosts, but also, I mean, just look at the place for the history as well. Seeing the bullet holes that were supposedly from Paul Kowski's murder. I tell you what though, if I was out over that way, I would absolutely get up early one day and make the trip over to Cerro Gordo. I am obsessed with the YouTube channel Ghost Town Living and how he's bringing Cerro Gordo back to life. So if you haven't watched Brent's videos, get on it. They are endlessly fascinating. And the way he goes down into those abandoned mines, terrifying, but also so entertaining to watch. But anyway, back to the Pioneer Saloon. I do believe that the place could be haunted. It is a very old building. It's been standing since Goodsprings was a mining boomtown. It's seen death. It's seen conflict. It's had countless people come through its doors in the over century that it's been here. Especially so when there are documented news reports of both Paul Kowski and Doc Harrison dying in the building. The thing that I just get caught up on though are the stories of these ghosts that are supposedly haunting the place where we don't have documented backstories. Not even much in the way of witness reports either. More just how they appear to psychic mediums. I do always take a medium's perspective with a hearty pinch of salt because there is no evidence to be able to back up what they're saying. Like I said before, it doesn't mean that it's all made up. It might just be that we don't have the records for it. But just when the name Ruby appeared during the Ghost Adventures investigation, and then now she's become this main entity in the saloon. I don't know. I would absolutely love it if one day we found out Ruby Hill Barnes' story and what actually happened to her, because I just don't believe that her body would have been found in the bathroom of the Pioneer Saloon in 1948 and there wouldn't be a single newspaper article about it. And with Carole Lombard, she never even went to the Pioneer Saloon. We don't know for sure whether Clark Gable did, so other than the piece of the wreckage that's on display there, she doesn't really have a connection to the place, or at least enough of one that would make me think that she is still hanging around there. I'd be more inclined to believe that Paul Kowski is still there, who's documented to have died there. Maybe the miner, if he was a regular, he just wanted another drink, wanted to come back to his favourite spot. Like, people that, to me, have a connection that makes sense. Do you know what I mean? But that's just my opinion. You may feel something entirely different. You may believe everything the psychic mediums say. You may think that you can't trust anything at all they say. That is entirely up to you. You may have even had an experience at the Pioneer Saloon yourself, which has made you 100% believe that there is something paranormal going on here. And if that is the case, please do share it in the comments. I do absolutely love hearing about people's encounters. Maybe the mine shaft below the saloon has something to do with the paranormal activity. If it's sort of like connecting the place to any deaths or tragedies that happened in the mines around Goodsprings. Or maybe something even a bit dodgy went down in the 1920s. I'm just gonna go out on a limb and speculate that they probably used the mine shafts in some capacity during Prohibition, surely. But then again, flip-flopping on either side of the fence this time, it is also worth mentioning, as with a lot of places that I talk about, they do make money from the paranormal. They do seem to run paranormal investigations. The paranormal is obviously a big draw for people visiting the saloon, so ghost stories are in their financial interests. They probably are going to talk about what psychic mediums say, and they're not really going to want to look into it too much in case it's not true. But then what gets me is, why not capitalise on a documented murder at the saloon and make up a story around Doc Harrison? Because as far as I can tell, they don't say that he does haunt the place, which would seem like an easy story to sell if that is what they were doing. So there is some credibility there. But also, it's a premises that supplies spirits of a different kind, so that could also make witnesses somewhat less reliable. All things to bear in mind when you draw your own conclusions, which I would love to hear about. Bottom line for me, I believe that there definitely could be something going on here. There's just too much history and intense, high emotion situations that have played out here for there not to be something. Because even going back further, before Goodsprings became a mining town, this land was home to the Southern Paiute people who lived here for generations before being displaced in the late 1800s. So whatever's going on, the history here goes back a long, long way. Either way, whichever side of the fence you sit on, I have loved doing the research for the Pioneer Saloon. I love any and all stories like this, about ghost towns, stories from the mines. I just love the Wild West and all of that. I had the Red Dead Redemption 2 ambience playing the entire time I was researching and writing this one. And before you ask, no, I still haven't got my 100% completion trophy. I just have a couple of challenges still to get through though, not too much. My biggest flex right now is that I have completed all of the gambler challenges, including the Dominoes one, and I've done the exotics missions, all of those spoon bills. If you know, you know. But if you enjoyed hearing all about the history and hauntings of the Pioneer Saloon just as much as I did putting this one together, please do pop the video a little like. And if you haven't already and you like what I'm doing over here, you might want to subscribe too. But anyway, that is all from me today. Go get a drink of water before you start mixing with any spirits of your own. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe.
You haven't been upstairs to see me in a long time, Lucy. People are forgetting what you look like. But you're just living your best life in your cardboard box.